This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the De Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered. Hey everybody, it's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 170 of the De Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network. As a school leader, when is it best to make top-down decisions, and when should you make it a collaborative process? How can you tell which stakeholder input to prioritize? What's the best way to communicate with your staff in a way that feels transparent but doesn't burden them with too much information? How can you make decisions confidently when you're supervising staff in positions you've never held yourself? I invited Dr. Jen Schwanke to episode 170 of the De Facto Leaders podcast to discuss these questions. Dr. Schwanke is a longtime educator, teaching and leading at all levels. She is the author of 4 ASCD books, including the recently released The Principal's Guide to Conflict Management, and has published hundreds of articles for various educational publishers. She has written and presented for various districts in the areas of school climate, personnel, and instructional leadership. She is an instructor in educational administration at Miami University of Ohio and The Ohio State University, and currently serves as a Deputy Superintendent in Ohio. You can find more information about her work at jenschwanke.com. In this conversation, we discuss getting to the root cause of pain points and how you can tell what people really need from you as a leader, being decisive versus being collaborative, the different types of decisions leaders need to make, and the strategies for handling them. When should we use our own expertise to solve problems, and when should we leverage the expertise of others? And then the idea of shaking things up versus maintaining the status quo, and how this changes the way that you lead, depending on what your school, your district, or your organization needs. In this episode, I mention the School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers develop a strategic plan for putting executive functioning support in place in collaboration with their school teams. To learn more about that program, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. Now, please enjoy this conversation with Dr. Jen Schwanke. Today, I'm joined by Jen Schwanke from Ohio, and you have many roles. I know you're a podcast host, you're involved in higher ed and a school administrator. So I think we can start off by having you just share a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Right. It's we were joking off the air, like who am I? I do. I have a lot of roles.
Well.
I have been a teacher 17 years as a school level leader, administrator, and then most recently I've been serving as a deputy superintendent in a pretty large district in Central Ohio. And then I'm also an author. I've written 4 books for ASCD. The most recent one, I think, that brought us together, Dr. Karen, is the Principal's Guide to Conflict Management. So that's my most recent work. And then all my books are really for principals and, to serve kind of as guides for them. And then I'm also an adjunct professor at Miami University of Ohio and the Ohio State University. And Will Parker and I co-host the Principal Matters podcast. So a lot of balls in the air, but all with the intent to support building principals and school administrators, superintendents, and especially teachers.
Yeah, I understand that well. When people say, tell me a little bit about yourself or tell me what you do, I'm like, which which title do I go
Right.
with today?
Well, exactly. And then there's the whole who I am as a human being too. So,
Yes, there's
I
that.
have kids and I have a husband and I have a lot of wonderful things too that don't define me as a school administrator. So, yeah, definitely keep busy, but I like all of the different identities that I have.
Yeah. Well, and you know what the most interesting thing is when you go into a different context and you always have to think, okay, which thing do I pull out for this group of people that I'm talking
Exactly.
to?
Right.
It's like if I'm talking to people from the schools, I'm like, well, I should say I'm an SLP, but I don't want them to only think that because then they think, I just work on ours. Or if then I go and talk to a group of social workers or administrators, then I want to pull out different things. So,
Well,
yeah.
exactly. And you and I have talked in the past about how that role specifically, the SLP role, and if you don't mind me telling your listeners my
Yeah.
story about SLPs,
Yeah. Go for it.
like many people, was trained as a teacher and I knew there were all these, there were some other people out there helping and
Yeah.
but they were kind of on the periphery. And then when I moved to my current town and got a teaching job, I was looking for a roommate and I became fast friends with the speech language pathologist in my school building. And we ended up being roommates. And it was basically a 2-year course in what SLPs do. And because of her close ties with the OT, the PT, the psych, and intervention specialists, I learned just from watching and listening to her talk about her work how incredibly deep that work is. I had joked to you earlier, I thought speech therapists just kind of worked on the R sound with
Yeah.
8-year-olds,
Most
right?
people, originally that's where they start. It's
Right.
fine.
And my friend Lisa was like, no, there's the whole language component, there's the executive functioning component, there's the way that the body and the mind work together, there's the parent piece, there's the special needs piece, there's the typically deforming piece. Like there were so many things that she used in her arsenal, if you will, of skills and strategies. And so it forever changed how I thought about those student services that we provide. And I didn't think then, I don't think now that we utilize that expertise nearly enough. I feel like one of the biggest flaws in the education world, is everybody thinks they're the expert. Like they're the one that knows it, but we
Hmm.
all do. We all have so much to give.
So, yeah, I agree with that. And I sometimes, it seems like sometimes people toggle between either thinking that they are the only one that knows about a certain thing because they just aren't aware of other people's expertise, or the other way around where it's more of an imposter syndrome thing where they actually should be more confident in their skills and be selling themselves to other people and trying to get into the room and different conversations. So I'm curious if you've seen that as well with some of those roles, or maybe if you've experienced that yourself.
Well, and I think it can be the exact same thing, just manifesting itself in different ways, right? So
Yeah, that's true.
many times when I see someone who seems very confident, I think it's one of two things. Either they're very, very confident, or they're very insecure and they're cloaking that under confidence. And so what I encourage people all the time, like it's okay to not know something. It's okay to know nothing if you tell yourself, well, I can learn it.
Hmm.
I'm a pretty competent person. Somebody hired me to do this job. I'm going to learn it. And so, the my experience learning what a speech therapist does happened to me, but it
Hmm.
taught me that going forward, learning like that had to happen with me, because of me, in spite of me. And so,
Yeah.
for example, when I first moved, I'm trained in 7 through 12, and then I got a job as an elementary principal, and I knew exactly zero about early literacy, right? And so I was like, well, I mean, I learned what a speech therapist does. I can learn what a reading teacher does. And so I made it my
Yeah.
business to go sit in that room and listen and ask questions and say with humility, I don't know anything. I want you to teach me. And so, to your point, I think there's a lot of times that, especially people who are asked to lead, they think it will show weakness if they say, I don't know anything about that. But I think it actually shows strength and confidence to say, I want to learn.
Hmm. Yeah. I love that because that is something that I think is appreciated by people who are in that subject matter expert role when somebody in a leadership position pulls them in. So maybe that's a good place to go next is so when you're in this role where you're a teacher and you're responsible for like and the way that I always frame it for people when I'm talking to therapists as far as how do you define everybody's roles, which of course there's a way you can define it and there has to be some flexibility within those definitions. But I always see it as there's these related service providers who are providing this specific expertise in their discipline. But yes, there's overlaps because you're working on a team and there's overlaps between what a therapist does and what a teacher does and what the different therapists do in their discipline. But then with teachers, you're an expert in your grade level and understanding what are the grade level expectations, what would we be expecting at this grade level to make sure that we're going to move kids on the right path, but then also being flexible to be able to differentiate and all of those things. So that's the way that I frame it for therapists who are working with in the schools. But then when you are in a role like you're in a role where you're working directly with students and then you shift to being an administrator and you're used to being a subject matter expert and now you have to lead all of the subject matter experts and it's impossible to be an expert in everything. So I would love for you to talk about making that shift yourself and what things were surprising and what things you learned throughout that process.
Well, I love that question because there's many layers to it, right?
Yeah.
And I think where I'd like to start is how I used to run meetings very badly.
Okay.
I would go in and okay, there's all these experts around the room and we have a couple parents and we have a lot of feelings and we have some expertise, but I'm not sure how we're going to channel it. And then somewhere along the way, somebody said, you should write an agenda for every meeting. Well, we didn't have time for that, right? And so
Yeah.
never really did that. So here's where I think I can answer your question and maybe provide a strategy. What
Yeah.
I like to do is say to everyone way before the meeting, like a particular meeting, but just have it be kind of a norm or a practice. Know your role in the meeting before
Mm-hmm.
you go in.
Yeah.
And if needed, even articulate it. So a side analogy would be like when you say to your best friend or your spouse or your partner, I don't need you to do anything. I just need you to be my friend right now.
Mm-hmm.
That
Mm-hmm.
can apply to any sort of educational setting. In this meeting, I bring the expertise about language and articulation, but I also have experience with this parent or with this student or with assistive technology. So I can be that expert if the conversation lends itself to need that. So I feel like as a leader, when we go into lead meetings, we should remember my role here is to facilitate, to mediate if necessary, to oversee, but I don't need to be a content level expert. I don't need to be an IEP writing expert unless that is something that's missing in the room. And if it's missing in the room, then the administrator or the leader should step in and fill that hole. Um, I think a lot of times it even helps to articulate it during the introduction phase. So, here's Mary. She's the occupational therapist, and she will be working with us on this student's applicable job skills. Here is the school psychologist. She's going to go over the testing that she did. So everyone knows exactly why they're at the table. And then if you veer off of that, that should also be articulated. So you might say, okay, I know I'm here because I wrote the IEP goals, but I'd like to share something that I learned from this teacher about small group instruction and how it might help this student. So you almost identify, hey, I'm going off script here because I have expertise in this area.
Yeah, I like that. I love the meeting agenda example because that's something that's coming up in my job right now. And there's been a couple times where I'm like, you're having this huge meeting with people. You have to post an agenda,
Right.
but it's
Right.
really not about the agenda.
No.
And so I remember I was complaining to some people about the lack of agendas on some of the meetings. And what somebody said was, well, really, it's not about the agenda. It's about the agenda just reflects the preparation and the communication that went into the meeting. And to be honest, you ask yourself, would I care if there was an agenda in this little scheduling link if I felt like we were communicating as a team going into the meeting? I
Exactly.
probably wouldn't care. And so it's those little things that come up. And so I guess that is, I'm wondering if you've seen other things. Well, people are upset about this thing over here, but it's really this
Right.
deeper thing that's going on. And this is just some external thing that's popping up.
Well, I mean, yes, yes, hallelujah, yes. It's not about the agenda. And many times our words aren't what they're about.
Yeah.
I actually do a lot of PD for principals around the country and in Canada. And one of the things that seems to resonate most is when I do this portion where I say what they're saying, but what they mean. And
Yeah.
it's really
Mm-hmm.
lighthearted and it's fun, but the principals that I work with are always blown away because I'm just going to do an example. We hear all the time ad nauseum. That's why you make the big bucks. And, it makes
Ah.
principals want to pull their hair out because a lot of times, sure, they make more money, but maybe not per
Not as
diem
much
or
as
whatever.
people think.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
certainly not per diem. But I tell them, don't get angry at that because that's not what they're saying. What they're saying is,
No.
I need help. I need
Mm-hmm.
help from someone who has different training, who has a different level of responsibility, who has maybe perceived or real respect and power that I don't have. Another example might be when a new principal takes over a building and they start to hear a lot, well, we've never done it that way, or that's not how we've always done it. That feels like a conversation stopper and a real, kind of being kicked in the knees. That's not what they're saying. What they're saying is, I'm scared. I don't know what we're doing here because it's new to me. Can you go back and tell me the why and help me through this? So, I have a list of about 20 things that school leaders hear all the time, and none of them are metaphorically about the agenda, right? None of them are that. It's usually rooted in a little bit of worry, a little bit of anxiety, a little bit of imposter syndrome, a little bit of I need you, leader. Another good example that gets a lot of laughs is, hey, got a minute? We hear that all the time as leaders, and we know it's not a minute. We know it's 5 minutes, but rather than be resentful about that, we should say, this person needs me. That's they're communicating, hey, can we talk? And that should be a gift rather than a burden.
Yeah. I love that. Is that a blog post or where is that list?
Well, it is in the conflict management book.
Okay.
It's kind of the last chapter because
Okay. We'll link to
again,
that
that's
because I'd love to
right.
see that list.
Yeah, and it's just fun and it helped my first 10 years as a principal, I walked around a little bit grumpy when I would hear these things because like, yeah, I got a minute. Well, that's not at all what they need. They need my undivided attention because they have something that they need to share with me.
Yeah. It's probably not 5 minutes too.
It's
It's
not
probably
5,
like
it's
30
right.
minutes.
It's 45. Another good one, and I don't want to totally hijack this conversation, but
No, I love it.
another one that's so common is just, hey, just a heads up. And I used to think, oh, you're shifting your problem to me, but it's not that. It's, hey, something's going on, and I'm worried that I can't handle it alone. I'm worried that you're going to either get involved or need to be involved. And so I want to tell you about that. I'm asking you to join my circle. I'm not just dumping a problem on you. So just a heads up is a phrase that's an opportunity rather than a warning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I use that one a lot too.
Yeah. Right. And it's good. It's
Yeah.
good. You just have to hope that the recipient sees it as such. Again, opportunity, not a warning.
Yeah. So I have a couple different things that I think we could talk about next, but and I think from both perspectives, because as the leader, you have information that other people don't have, and your job is to be the human shield and protect from some of those things or remove the barriers so that people can do their jobs. So, and I know that on the other end of it, when you're the person who is receiving the information, sometimes it feels like why aren't they including me? Why aren't they being more transparent about things? Why are we doing a complete 180 here? Or
Mhm.
and those are some of the things that I hear from people who are receiving some of this information coming down. And I'm always curious what that's like, being the person that has to filter all this information and figure out what do I share to who, when, how, and how that was for you making that shift, and what
Right.
things surprised you, and how do you make those decisions as to when do I need to pull in feedback from people and get input from other people who maybe have expertise, versus this is a time when I need to make a decision and just give
Right.
some guidance here and be more almost authoritative about it.
Right. Well, first of all, you're a very good podcast interviewer because that's an excellent question again. And it really gets to the heart
Yeah.
of what I think is most troublesome about being a leader, because you're given this responsibility to filter information and keep the goals or the mission, so to speak, of the work in the forefront. But yet you have people who are saying that makes no sense. Why would she do that? That's the exact opposite of what she said last week. What's happening? And I think a mistake that many leaders make, and I'm using leaders as the word rather than principals, because so many people are in this exact situation. An intervention specialist who's leading a team of paraprofessionals, a speech language pathologist who's developing a therapy plan, whatever. Whenever you're a leader, I think a mistake might be, okay, I'm the leader, I'm going to make people mad. It's just the way it is. That certainly is true, but it can be less so if we just communicate the not all the information, but the structure of the information. So here's an example. We might say, okay, last week, this is the information we had. Now a few things have changed, and so we're going to go a different direction. And not say it as in, I am the wise one with all the information, you don't have it. Say what you can, because people really do well when they have the why. But even a layer lower than that is about trust. I find that people are much more forgiving about a lack of information if they know you're doing your best, that you're being transparent, that you do take time to study and think and plan for a decision. So in the book, I have this a 3-step, I don't even like process, but it's a 3-step cycle: anticipate, analyze, and act. And I think leaders can do well if they anticipate things as they come, then they really pause and think through all the components of the decision, and then they act, and then they do it again, and they do it again, and they do it again. When others see us being so thoughtful, approaching problems with curiosity rather than a sledgehammer, they will be more prone to say, okay, that person's thoughtful about that decision, and I'm happy to follow their lead. So I got a little bit metaphorical there, but it is a real challenge, I think, for leaders to make peace with the fact that they are sometimes the one that's hired to make the decision, but they also want things to be continually and consistently collaborative.
Yeah. And I think it's when you're a principal, I know that as the teacher, you think the principal's making these decisions, but then they have these there. Did you find that you're sometimes toggling between roles, between the decision maker and then the person who's also frustrated that people who you're reporting to aren't telling you about the decisions?
Right.
Like
Well, that's
what's that like? Because I that's
right.
that's my life right now.
Right, right. And well, here's the elephant in the room. A
Yeah.
principal and someone in your role is truly in middle management,
Yes,
and they're getting
absolutely.
squished from the top because there's all these things that people at the top need to say and get done. And
Yeah.
then you're being squished from the people who to whom you report, whether
Yeah.
that's a child or a parent or whatever. I used to joke, I have 3,000 bosses because I have
Yeah.
1,000 students. All of them have 2, 3, sometimes 4 parents. I have my bosses, I have my teachers. I have so many people who can tell me what to do or how to do it.
Mhm.
And that can truly feel like being gripped in a vice, and you're like, I can't make anybody happy. One thing that helps for me is to articulate what kind of decision this is.
Yeah.
So, you and I actually talked about that earlier. Like, there are decisions where I can say, hey guys, I had to act fast. Here's the information I had. This is the decision. Thank you so much for, giving me a little bit of grace as we implement this. Then there might be a decision where I articulate, this is a process decision. We need to develop steps, or we need to develop a system and get input along the way. And then there might be a decision that is a collaborative decision. We're going to make focus groups. We're going to get some task forces together. We're going to think about this. We're going to take our time. And so it's not, I'm packaging it kind of as a speed decision, deciding based on speed, how quickly a decision needs to be made. And I don't mean to do that. There are things that, hey, this is the way it is. So for a principal, we're going to have our fire drills on these dates, and we're going to all go stand out on this, say, football field, and we're going to line up, we're going to take attendance. That's a decision that is made, and everybody, let's just do this. But then it might be a decision where, hey, we're going to completely redo the master schedule, but we're not doing it this year. We're going to take all of this year, and once a month, different people are going to get together and look at our model or our shell. So to articulate what kind of decision it is kind of alleviates anxiety for the people that it's going to affect, because they'll know which type of decision it was, and therefore why it was made that way.
I'm going to take a quick break here to talk about the School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers develop a strategic plan for putting executive functioning support in place. In this conversation, we're talking a lot about collaboration, decisions, and all the different types of decisions that school leaders need to make. And one of the themes is that sometimes leaders need to make decisions from the top because they have to do with things that wouldn't make sense to involve a huge team. And sometimes you just need to make a decision for purposes of efficiency to make sure that people aren't burdened by them in their day-to-day jobs. But some decisions require a team effort. And things like executive functioning that involve multidisciplinary teams and involve ongoing coaching are definitely one of those things that has to do with that ongoing collaboration. But the thing is that this requires a lot of content area expertise. And many school administrators have so many other things that they need to think about on a daily basis that this might not be something they can devote a lot of time to. So here is where related service providers can be a huge asset to their teams, because they can bring their subject matter expertise in areas like language and cognition and really guide their teams into making good decisions for putting support in place for kids. And I'm talking about classroom-based support at the Tier 1 level, all the way through kids who need intensive specialized interventions. To learn more about the program, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. So if you are a speech pathologist, a social worker, a psychologist, a counselor, an OT, or really any other provider who is responsible for doing those specialized interventions, and you want to create that opportunity to support the teachers and the students across the day, you can learn more about how to do that in the School of Clinical Leadership. To learn more about what's included in the program, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. Now, let's get back to the interview. I like that. I like the categories of decisions because,
Right.
And you know what? I think that sometimes people, I'm sure that people tend to use one more type of decision-making process than the others. Like whatever they're comfortable with, that's what they lean towards. And then some people like to receive things in a certain way. Some people love certainty, like tell me what to do. Just tell me what we're doing so that I can have certainty that I have permission to do it this way. And then other people maybe are the other way around, where they want the autonomy and they don't want somebody telling them what to do.
Well, and sometimes they want both, or they want neither. And everything's a pendulum, right? And so this was years ago, but we used to write building level goals. And one year I wrote the goals and I said to the teachers, okay, here's the goals. And they were really unhappy. They said, well, that should be collaborative. And I'm like, great. So the next summer I bought lunch 3 or 4 days. I had people come in. They're like, we don't want to come in the summer and be part of this. Okay, great. I'll try it during the school year. So that's when you start to feel like you cannot win. And so how in the world do you make people happy in that situation? And again, I think this is how you do it. You say, these goals are a decision that I just made, and then we're all going to adapt them individually for our classrooms. Or I could have said, this is a process decision. I'm going to do this by this date. You are all welcome to come in and contribute on this date. Or I could have made it a collaborative process where we spend all year talking about the goals.
Mhm.
I don't think it necessarily matters a lot of times how you approach it, but it's all about pre-planning. And if you don't have that time, then sometimes you say, guys, it's just what it is. But many times leaders will get feedback and because they're hurt or they feel betrayed or they feel like they failed, they go completely the other way.
Mhm.
I worked with a principal once and he said, I took over for someone who was a poor communicator. He would just send out emails with facts and nobody ever knew why. And he said, so my first 6 months, I told them everything. Here's all the information. Here's what I was thinking. Here's how I was feeling. Here I got to this decision. And he said, and now they're mad because they say I communicate too much. And I said, that's because you're not differentiating your decision making to the information that's applicable. And you're just, you're trying to solve a problem by being the opposite of what the problem was.
Yeah.
So slow your roll and think more carefully. Is this something anybody really cares about? And if there's one person complaining, go to that one person. We never want to reprimand an entire class because one student talked. We have to figure out what the real problem is.
Yeah. That's that is kind of interesting. If you try to make everybody happy, you're not making anyone happy.
Right,
That's
right.
always how it is.
And it's too often when there's one person who's grumpy, we think they speak for everyone else. And meanwhile, everybody else might be, at the pool eating a snow cone, not thinking about it at all.
Yeah. How often, and I think about this in lots of different contexts because in the work I do independently as a self-employed person, there's a lot with the sales and the marketing aspect. And there was this one program I went to and they always used to say, bring the data, not the drama. And in the context they were using it was, we were talking about Facebook ads and we're looking in this dashboard and all these numbers. So you put out a Facebook ad, it goes out to a lot of people. People are going to make negative comments.
Right,
Like it's just going to happen.
right,
And sometimes they might be giving you legitimate feedback. A lot of times it's just trolls.
right,
And
right,
so what they would say to us is, let's look at your numbers. We understand what good numbers look like across all of this whole funnel or this whole system that you've built. Let's see if there are bottlenecks. And then let's go and look at what people are saying and let's look more qualitatively into this once we've looked at the data. And I think that has happened, like, for example, when I used to sit on the problem solving team in the school, sometimes the teachers would come in and they'd have to report on a student and they'd be really stressed out. And maybe it's that student, but then it's the other student. And you get this kind of, this narrative that's kind of jumping around and you can tell that they're really frustrated, but then it's hard to pinpoint what the issue is. And so we'd almost have to steer them back to data, and this is the information that we need from you. And then we can start to go into these anecdotal examples that's going to paint a bigger picture of this data. And with the marketing example, I think that's could apply to a lot of the leadership things where it's okay, just because it's one person complaint, it doesn't mean that it's a problem. Maybe it's okay. Maybe most of the people are all right and your outcomes are okay. And it's the problem isn't what they're really saying. Like,
right,
so
right. And I think that's a wonderful analogy because so many leaders are so gun shy and so anxious about this whole social media piece of it. And
Oh
that's why I think
yeah.
that
That could
analogy
be a
is
whole
so
other
good,
podcast.
right? So when you're working independently and you're like, okay, I'm going to figure out this social media, a Facebook ad, and then the first three comments are horrible and insulting and upsetting, and you say, okay, well, I don't want to do this anymore, but those people were trolls, right?
Yeah.
And so the exact same thing applies to principals who are navigating their work. um, let's just go with the analogy. They might post about a lovely event their school had, and the first two comments are parents who um, did not have a good experience.
Hmm.
So I see principals then say, okay, well, we're not doing this anymore, or well, we're not going to do it this way anymore. We're going to completely change it. And they forget that's 2 out of maybe 1,000 people.
Hmm.
And so what I encourage principals to do, by the way, side note, is you have to own those Facebook groups. You have to have the ability to not approve comments. So if one person is going to complain about their own individual experience, that you can make a phone call rather than cancel an event or
Hmm.
totally upend the whole apple cart. But to your point, I think that so many times we think one voice speaks for everyone. And because we are a society that tends to be swayed by what we read on social media, it feels dangerous, right? To have lost control of people's thoughts and beliefs, but we never controlled them in the first place. That's
Yeah.
the thing to remember about that. I love, by the way, when you talk about your experience going out as an independent, being self-employed, because I think for many principals, that's a dream to
Hmm.
consult and to own their own company, but there's a lot to it. You and I have talked before about, just that marketing piece and the sales piece and having to hustle to get clients and all the travel and all of that. So thank you
Yeah.
for continuing to remind those of us that are working in different type of jobs that there's a lot
Yeah.
to it.
And as we talked before, I left and came back.
Yeah.
And that was an interesting experience. And whenever you do something different, people in your life react to that for better or worse. They
Right. They
always
all
want
have
to give their
opinions.
input. Like you
Right.
leave your secure job and it's, are you sure? But then
Right.
you're in this world of people who are, oh, we don't want to work for the man. And now you're going to go back to doing that. And I had people say things like, oh, after a year, you're going to want to leave. And I'm like, I don't know that I will,
Right. Right.
you
Well,
know?
everybody talks from the lens of their own experience, right?
Yeah.
But I talk to principals a lot who say, I want to go out, I want to consult, I want to do my own thing. And I'm like, just know what it is. Know
Hmm.
what it is. It's not the moment that's posted on LinkedIn. There's a lot of grunt work that happens before that moment. When
I
you take
was
the
sharing
picture.
with my husband. So, you get, and of course, it's interesting. You sign up for one course about how to start a business, and then here all the ads come on your Facebook feed to, you know, all the people that maybe they have been doing this for a couple months and they think they're an expert now. And then some
Right.
people legitimately are experts.
Right.
I've learned a lot from signing up for other people's courses and all of that in the self-employed world. But there was one person who I was following, and I think it was like when I was about to leave, and she was selling this thing about how to leave your job in 18 months by blogging. And so I was listening to some of her stuff, and it was good and helpful. And I wouldn't say that what she told me was a decision maker. And when I decided to leave, it was obviously a lot of conversations between my husband and I and all kinds of things. But then about 3 years later, she was selling another course about how to be the CEO of your business. And she was sharing, well, 3 years ago when I was living off of ramen noodles and I
Right.
couldn't pay my staff. And I'm like, wait a minute, you were telling me how awesome it was. And the narrative always changes. And so I think that a lot of times people are there was this trend that went out recently where it's social media isn't real, and all of these things. One
Right.
person was a fitness influencer, and she was showing, this is what I look like when I'm posed, and if I just snap the picture, this is what I look like. And it
Right.
was I mean, it was very different.
Right.
So
Well,
yeah.
exactly. And the again, there's this narrative out there, go out there and the world will listen. And that's not necessarily true. It is an
No,
immense amount of
not now.
hard work
It
to
is really
get
hard work.
yourself hired, right? And like you said, not only was she trying to share her expertise, but she was trying to get you to eat ramen noodles too. Like, look at this
Yeah.
great life I have. And 3 years later, you find out that she's barely paying her people. So
Yeah.
it never is as it looks, as it appears to be.
Well, and I think that that's another example, which you could translate over to education, where there are a lot of skill sets that are required to be a good leader. For example, with the marketing thing, you could be amazing at graphic design and copywriting, but you might be, maybe you're not as strong in operations and hiring and HR. And if you don't know how to do that stuff, yeah, you might be able to write a good ad, but then can you handle the back end of your business? If you're in a leadership position and maybe you're, if you've ever worked with leaders who are really charismatic, like I worked with somebody who it's like when he was a teacher, everybody wanted to be in his class. And he was just a very good, I would say at the PR piece, like a very good public presence. But then he needed support with more of the systems things. So he needed to work with people who he could have this big idea and people could help him implement. But if he didn't have that, nothing would have gotten done. And so you're strong in one area. And I think that goes back to the transparency of saying, this is what I'm teaching you and this is what I'm giving you, and not presenting it like this is everything you need to know about this.
Well, and that's exactly it, Karen. Like we expect leaders to be masters of all.
Yeah.
And then when they're not, we're mad, right? But of
Mm-hmm.
course we don't have all those skills. And I think it's so much of a relief when we say, hey, this is a weakness for me. I'm going to need to have help. And we also need to know when our specific skills are needed.
Mm-hmm.
A quick example, 20 years ago, when I first went to, well, I guess it was a little bit more, maybe 18 years ago. Again, I'd been in the secondary world, and my superintendent talked to me about an interim opening at an elementary school. And I was super excited to take it, but I literally knew nothing, zero,
Mm-hmm.
about elementary school. And I said, what do I do? And he said, this school's been through a lot. Will you please just go be nice to them? And he said it tongue in cheek, but I'm like, oh, I can do that. So
Uh-huh.
I went in and I just got to know people, and I was, I built them up and I made their collective efficacy, if you will. That was what I worked on. That was my sweet spot. I was so good at that. But then after that, the work got real, right? And so I had to start saying, hey, to my point earlier, I don't really know anything about early literacy. I better learn. I
Mm-hmm.
don't really know how to build a master schedule. I better see who's doing it and learn from them. And so, still to this day, I'm not an expert on those things, but I know it. And so I can say, let's bring some other people to the table, because I think so many times this especially happens to new principals. They get this key handed to them and, hey, you're in charge. And they're
Yeah.
like, all right, I either have to know it all or I have to fake it. And neither of those are a good strategy. I think it's the best way, as you know, to your point, is to know what skills you bring to the table, pull them out when they're necessary, and ask for help when you're doing something else.
Yeah. I love that you brought that example up because that was one of the other topics that we wanted to talk about, the idea of the power of a crisis from, and I got that from, it's The Power of Habit is the book. Charles Duhigg is the author, and he just wrote another book as well that I just read. But I remember that chapter because he talks about how it seems like an easy way out to walk into a situation where everything's going well.
Hmm.
Like here's this top performing school, and then you can be the leader that's affiliated with this school that's doing really well. But what happens when you walk into a situation that desperately needs a change? So
Exactly.
I'm curious what that was like for you, being that person that walks into a situation where people know that they need to do something different. And is it easier, harder than the easy quote in this big air quotes, easy
Right.
situation?
Right. Well, and there's a debate out there. Do you want to follow the football coach who won the national championship, or do you want to follow a football coach that went 0 and 10?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think there is a right answer to that. I think the right answer lives in the person who hired you, to say, what are you hiring me to do? Does this school, for example, need help with their special education? Does this school need pushed in terms of instructional leadership? Does this school just need someone to be nice to them? Is there no problem? Like, what is it that I need to go in and do? And I hear many principals get really, when they're looking for their first principal job, they're like, I'm not getting hired.
Yeah.
And I will say to them, maybe you're not, the people who are looking to hire aren't sure you can do what it is that they need done for that school. So ask,
Yeah.
what are you looking for? Are you looking for change? Are you looking for status quo? I have a friend who was actually interviewing for superintendent jobs, and he asked that of the Board of Education, and the board said, literally, no, we're happy with good enough. And he was incensed. And I said, don't be incensed. They told you the truth. They're
Yeah.
happy. They're fine. That is what it is. And so if you want to go in there with a wrecking ball and blow things up, they're not going to like you. They
Yeah.
told you. It goes back to that great phrase, when people show you who they are, believe them. That's fine. So you didn't get the job because you wanted to go in there and make change. You belong in a different district. That's
Yeah.
that's just the truth.
That's a good example.
Yeah.
So how when you are working with people, like mentoring people who are on a team, and they maybe have some opportunities to use that same principle that you just said, what does this person need from me in this moment? Example that I often see is, I'm the subject matter expert. I have kids on my caseload. They're going out into the classroom, and I need to make sure that they get the support that they need across the day. And I have an idea as a subject matter expert about how that should look. But they're going out into a teacher's classroom, and maybe that teacher thinks the problem is something different.
Right.
So, how do I, as the subject matter expert, get my foot in the door with that teacher
Right.
and start to do what I think needs to happen, but also address what they think needs to happen?
Right, right. Well, that's as they say, threading a very fine needle.
Yeah.
I think it starts with building a relationship with that teacher, and that is the most overused phrase in education. I'm sorry, I just said that, but
Yeah.
getting to know this teacher, how experienced are they? Is their belief of what needs to happen with this child based on experience, or is it covering up fear and anxiety of, I don't know what to do with this kid, so I'm going
Yeah.
to do what worked with a kid 2 years ago who had a similar profile. What is it that's creating that barrier? And I see um, many folks in specialized situations like you're describing who tend to be anxious about pushing. So they'll say, okay,
Mm-hmm.
teacher, you're the expert. I'm here if you need me. And then they retreat.
Mm-hmm.
And because that's the path of least resistance, where I think continuing to articulate, here's what I can bring to you, might help tear down those barriers. Many times teachers will say, just take the kid.
Mm-hmm.
you
Yeah.
know, I won't pull out. I don't want push in, and I don't want you to tell me how to do it. I just want you to take the kid for 25 minutes a day and then bring him back, and then we'll be fine. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So that's so hard for, I'm just going to use SLP. That's so hard for an SLP to swallow, so to speak, because the teacher's closing the door on such an opportunity. And I think it takes time. I think it
Yeah.
takes continual experiences with the teacher or the principal to gain that respect and that reciprocity, so to speak, where, hey, teacher, I see the amazing things you're doing. Here's some ways that I can help without sitting there or without doing one-on-one pull-out therapy. Um, I think a lot of the problems with situations like this are turnover of the kids, right? Because they're only there a year and
Yeah.
then they've moved on. Turnover of staff. Um, Many people going to find a different opportunity because they're so frustrated with this one.
Yeah.
And it just takes an immense amount of time. And I think a lot of the root of these barriers I'm talking about is anxiety, because when we're not sure who's going to be blamed when things don't go well and who's going to get credit when they do, it's a bit of a power struggle, right? Like,
Yeah.
how do you give up the expertise works and give it that opportunity to someone else? Well, what does that mean in terms of what I'm blamed for and what I'm celebrated for?
Yeah, that is a good point because it does seem like in that situation that it could fall on the teacher more so than it could the other people who are just coming in for a therapy session once a week,
Right.
especially if people don't realize the scope of the therapist. If you think that I am just the person who works on stuttering in ours, and this student has language issues that are impacting them across their day, but the teacher is the one that's responsible for delivering the instruction, who is someone going to think is, I don't want to say whose fault is it,
Whose
which
fault
isn't
is
the
it?
right way to say it, but that
Right.
might be how someone would see it.
Well, exactly. And I think that is at the root of a lot of the conflict in education. And I always say to people, the 10th grade teacher thinks the ninth grade teacher didn't do anything. The
Oh
ninth grade
yeah.
teacher thinks the eighth grade teacher didn't do anything. The eighth grade
Yeah.
teacher all the way down, right? And there's a lot we have to unpack there. If the fifth grade teacher says to their class, you didn't learn about fractions last year, and the kids are like, nope, nope, didn't learn a thing. Nope, didn't do fractions at all. Well, of course they did. Come
Yeah,
on,
that's
right?
that's the other problem.
Right.
You're
Of
relying
course
on
they did.
the
Right. And
opinion.
so if a teacher says to a student, "Hey, what did you do when you went to see Dr. Karen?" Nothing. We played Connect 4. The teacher's like,
Yeah,
well,
that's
must
all
be
you do in
nice.
speech.
Exactly. Must be nice. And then the speech therapist pulls the student and says, what were you doing in social studies? And the student says, watching a movie. No. So there's sometimes, first of all, we rely on children to explain what it is that they're learning and doing, and that's a mistake. Secondly, there isn't, I just wish if I had a magic wand, I could sprinkle respect amongst our professional cadre, because there's so much good work going on. And sometimes we get way bent out of shape based on our perceptions of what another person does. I worked in a school once where the teachers were just always at the throats of the reading teachers because, man, it looked like a great job. You get 2 or 3 kids at a time. You
Oh
pull
yeah,
out,
I've
so,
heard that.
must be great. And then the reading teachers were at the teacher's throat because they're like, must be nice to have a plan period. Must be nice to, have all these therapists come in and pull students out. And I finally said, guys, stop. Stop, stop, stop. We deserve better from each other. We deserve to recognize everybody's working absolutely as hard as they can. Their day, their rhythm, their patterns look very different from yours, but that doesn't mean that they're not really contributing to this school environment. And it's not like my words helped, but sometimes we just need that reminder that this isn't easy for anyone. And the microscope is on all of us. And if something doesn't work, it really does belong to all of us. I've done a lot of work with principals on collective efficacy. And, anybody listening can Google this. It has 3 times the impact of a lot of the things that we look at. We look at home environment, we look at support, we look at homework. We have these really passionate bites about those things. What matters more than any of those is something you can't even touch, and that's a belief in one another, a belief in our staff, a belief that we together are really, really awesome. That is what principals should focus on rather than some of this ticky-tack stuff that we spend our time on.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Well, we could keep going, but I know that we've been
Your
going for a
poor
while, and
listeners,
I
I
know that
feel
we
bad
both
for
have to get to our day jobs.
Yes, we have real jobs. I do feel bad for your listeners because they're probably like, man, these two girls, they could talk for days. We could, I think, right? We
Yeah,
could.
this is another one of my personal pain points is that if you want to do well on social media, you need the sound bites, the 30-second
Right.
clip. I am not, that is a what's the positive thing? It's a learning opportunity for me to be concise and not have to talk for an hour about something to get my point across. But that's always fun when you get asked to do PD and they're like, "Can you come talk for an hour?" And I'm like, "Well, normally that takes me 40 hours." Um,
Right.
and I
Right.
still keep adding to it. But so I think what we could do is where can people find out about your work, especially your books and some of the things that came up or your podcast?
Yep, absolutely. So they can find me at jenschwanke.com. There's a lot of information there about my books and also opportunities if you want to work with me in any way. You can just drop me a form there on the website. My books are all published by ASCD, and you can find them at the ASCD website for a discount if you're a member, or on Amazon, of course. And then Will and I are our podcast is everywhere you find podcasts, much like this one, and also at principalmatters.com, which is Will's website. And then I'm on LinkedIn, of course, and on X. I guess I have to start saying X. So
Yeah.
reach out to me anytime.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you. That was so fun.
Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check the show notes for all the places you can go to connect with Dr. Schwanke, as well as the links to all of her resources, and to learn more about the School of Clinical Leadership. To learn more about the School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers emerge as leaders on their team in the area of executive functioning interventions, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. It always helps me out so much if you share this episode with your colleagues and if you leave me a rating or review wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you have a suggestion for a guest, if you would like to be a guest on De Facto Leaders, or if you are interested in having me be a guest on your show, please email me at talktome@drkarenspeech.com. Thank you again for listening, and I will see you next time.